Dr. Rajan, thank you very much for being here at King's Business School. We're delighted that you've made the time to come and talk with us today. Earlier today, we were talking about Gandhi's legacy, and I want to start with that. In your book, The Third Pillar, you emphasize the role of communities and inclusive growth. And I wanted to get your thoughts on how much of that is, inspired by Gandhi's philosophy and thinking.
Well, I think there are strong parallels, and I think while I didn't explicitly sort of research Gandhi's views on this, I noted as I was finishing the book how strongly this resembled some of what he was thinking about. And I think for similar reasons, he sort of felt that the village was the real unit in India, and that an autonomous village was generally a good thing. And he wanted more empowerment of the village, and I think for all the right reasons. Now, we also know that Ambedkar criticized the village as being hidebound and oppressive, and I think both arguments are in fact right at the same time. That these small communities can be very oppressive. But they can also be a source of great support, of nurturing, of strength, of values. And how do you get the good while leaving out the bad? And that's where these seemingly contradictory terms, localism, but inclusive. In other words, short walls around the community, not high walls. High walls would keep out the outside and force the inside to stay in. Low walls would say, if it becomes very oppressive, you can jump out. And you're not keeping out ideas from the outside coming in and fertilizing. It's not a static society. It's a dynamic community. And I think this is where I believe we will go tomorrow. The community of tomorrow has to accept that ideas will keep fertilizing it. New ideas, there will be change. At the same time, there's enough of a sense of cohesion that people will support each other. It's not an anonymous, identityless environment, which sometimes the modern city becomes.
Yeah, as telecommunications has increased, social media is completely an anonymized way of reflecting opinion. But while we're on the topic of communities, you talk also about devolved decision making. And while I can see, of course, that would be very useful in a lot of contexts on day-to-day governance basis, what could be the limits to that approach? For instance, some issues are clearly global, such as climate change, or have very, very large implications. Would you like to reflect a bit on that?
Actions that need to be taken at the global level ought to be discussed locally. It doesn't mean that everybody has a veto on what happens, but you have to convince people more broadly that what you're doing is right. And their ownership of the idea will allow them to think locally of things they can do to supplement the global objective. So climate change and the actions to address it are not going to be decided in Paris in COP21 or COP25 or COP28 or whatever. Those decisions that governments come to there are far more likely to change people's behavior, which is important, if you follow a bottom-up approach of consensus seeking. Now that's difficult.
Sure. And
you can't do it on everything, but think of what happens when, in order to sort of respect the climate and reduce emissions, you raise gasoline taxes in France. You have the whole Gilets jaunes protest from people who say, you're worried about the end of the world, I'm worried about surviving till the end of the month. And that means you haven't taken them into confidence. Why is it that you're levying these gasoline taxes? Is there something that would be less harmful to these people who actually have to earn a living?
Right.
There are trade-offs. And if you don't do it democratically, you find pushback. Better to take people into confidence. That said, to your point, absolutely, there is a principle called subsidiarity, which comes from the Catholic Church, which is push decisions down to the lowest level which can take it effectively, and not any lower. So I'm not saying that, for example, car emission standards should be decided by each community. I mean, there is a healthy dialogue going on in the US whether California has the right to decide those emission standards, or whether the US government will decide it for the entire country. And I think there is some value to competition in standards, but ultimately the country needs one standard. And it is possible that, that one standard will emerge through competition, but it's easier to impose it by fiat, which is what the central government there is trying to do. But broadly, for smaller decisions, licensing stores in your neighborhood, why can't that be a local decision? And with more automation, we have the capacity to both undertake these decisions, inform the community, but also have it monitored lightly by central authorities. So much more can be pushed down today than you could in the past.
Fair enough. I think one of the things that I was thinking about was also coordination of effort and opinion across multiple communities when the outcomes or implications are much larger in scope. But I agree, if we think of it as a relative, then certainly much more can go down than currently is being done. Many contemporary economists would sympathize with Gandhi's ideas about economic self-sufficiency because they arose in a context when India was facing exploitation by colonial forces.
Well, exploitation typically comes from a monopoly situation where you're at the mercy of somebody or something which has either power or resources that you need and can withhold those from you. I think a competitive world with more competition in the areas where there is exploitation will create more, so will reduce the extent of exploitation. So how do we make the world more competitive? And this is where I am not against isolating the community from outside influences. Because I think competition is, while it strains the community by providing a lot more choice, and sometimes restricting choice is the way to keep relationships, but it also allows the ability to break an oppressive, exploitative relationship and to go outside. And so what we need to do is ensure that the good that the community provides is strong enough to overcome the lure of the outside. Right. And that's why competition is a good thing, because at the fringe it reduces the limit to which the relationship can become exploitative. Right. That's what we should strive for, both within countries and across countries. So when we're thinking of these trade relationships, right, competition in trade is a good thing. The US doesn't have to buy from China. Why doesn't it buy from somewhere else if it wants to? Similarly, China should have that choice. Changing tacks a little bit, we are at a business school today, and I want to think about or reflect your reflections on the role of business. Over time, there's been a growing distrust of business, either partly because of the financial crisis, but also because we see evidence of growing wealth inequality. And in response to that, there have been calls for businesses to do more than they currently do. What do you think is the role of businesses in strengthening our communities, in promoting inclusive growth? And do they have a role to play in that? On the one hand, businesses have got a bad name, sometimes deservedly so, because as they grub for influence. But sometimes, because they're being asked to do many more things than they're really competent to do. A business can't govern the local community. It can't provide public services. Public services are the role of the government. A business, its fundamental duty is to produce the product it produces at high quality and at low price, offering people choice. If it does that badly and does everything else well, it's not doing its job. Okay, so let's start with that. Now, one has to be careful about pushing the businesses into areas they're not competent. For example, would you rather that Facebook self-regulate itself, or would you want an outside regulator? Clearly it can hire the best people to self-regulate, but you don't think it has the right incentives. Like there's a conflict of interest. Exactly. So you would want the government to regulate Facebook. Right. Similarly, private companies undertaking public services, you have to be worried a little bit on how they do that and what the motivation for that, and is it given without sort of interest. Sure. And in fact, so it's as much will they deliver it properly as, should the government be imposing on them to do it. There are some areas where the company may be the only entity to be able to provide that service. For example, in a developing country, you have a local sort of township, company township, and maybe there's a hospital there. So many companies will say, okay, in order to provide a service to the community which the local government is incapable of providing, simply because it doesn't have the capabilities, resources, we will open the hospital to the local neighborhood. Right. That's not a bad thing to do. You're filling in a gap. But you must remember, as the capabilities increase, you should withdraw. Because that is something the government should be providing. Right. And once the company is providing it, there's always the possibility, oh, you didn't buy my product, you don't get to buy it, you don't get hospital services. There's a danger of pushing companies into areas they shouldn't be in. There's also a danger of, we can't get regulations through the public discourse, through democracy. So we privately force it on the company, right? So people say, oh, you should respect environmental standards. Well, create the law that forces them to respect environmental standards. Don't have a hypothetical law which you can't get through Parliament, right, but which holds them to a much higher standard than the law that you're willing to pass. That is saying democracy. The larger group of people or their representatives don't want to pass that law. So right, isn't this, in a sense, an unfair use of law? Right. So I would say clearly companies have to have a broader view of what they're about than just shareholder value maximization. I talk in the book about thinking about the long-term investors in the firm, for example, your employees, and you may want to enhance their value, and by doing that you enhance the societal whole. Right. You can also be useful in filling in holes that are left because there simply doesn't exist capacity in the economy. And finally, there are times when corporations should stand up, right, when in fact the system is under threat. But apart from these, I think a general sense that they should do more, I think you have to get more specific than that.
Fair enough. And I mean, some of the examples you give are certainly very useful. I've often thought that in areas where state capacity is poor, like you said, companies can benefit, can derive value from doing something for the community. Like by creating healthcare, you ensure that your employees are healthy and able to come to work.
But plus, you can't keep them healthy when the rest of the community is not healthy.
Exactly, that's right as well. But what that also sort of made me think about is that would that in the medium to long term perhaps crowd out state capability?
Which is why I think you have to be very careful right, about requiring to, it crowds out, it also disincentivizes.
Exactly,
so,
that's what I meant.
People don't hold the government to task.
Exactly.
Why aren't you providing medical facilities? Because Tata Steel is providing it.
Precisely.
So why worry?
Precisely. That's exactly what your comments made me think of. So yeah, there is a balance to be struck and one has to be careful. I'd like to conclude by asking you a very broad question. What, in your opinion, are some of the big emerging challenges that the world is likely to face over the next decade that we are ill prepared for, that we might struggle to cope with? And in light of that, what would be your advice to students of business and economics to focus their energies on?
The three big ones that come to mind immediately is dealing with technological change, the aging of industrial country populations and some emerging populations, and of course climate change. Right. I mean, there are no bigger challenges than these three. The problem is this already have subverted the existing system we have of global management, the old world order, so to speak. And there's nothing to replace it. But we have one planet. We need a system of dialogue and discourse and interchange. And if we're throwing out the old, what is the new? That needs to be created. And that's it's easier said than done because countries have their own views on what they need and what they want, and they can be quite different across countries. So we need a new world order. We should do it before a crisis comes. And we needed to deal with some of these problems, the aging of populations, the absorbing technological change properly and channeling it in the right way to enhance our well-being, and of course climate change. So I think for young students, challenge is good. It means all the problems aren't solved.
That's right.
Some of it comes from agitation, the Greta Thunbergs of the world. Some of it comes from, okay, now let's stop agitating. Let's start actually devising some solutions. And solutions almost always imply trade-offs.
Right.
There's no, one way without worrying about what the other consequences are. Let's sort of figure out. All the time I've spent in policies tells me that that's the one thing. There are no clean magic bullets. It's always trade-offs. It's always muddling through, but muddling through in a way that you make progress towards your destination.
Absolutely, and I'm sure some of them need to remain within the system to change it.
Of course, some will be within the system, some will be breaking down their doors,
right.
But I think together it's an effective combination.
Great. So on that note, I'd like to thank you again. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us today, and we're delighted to have you here.